Fethullah Gülen has written and spoken extensively on the process of polishing the heart that underlies the development of the moral selfhood and compassionate engagement central to his life and the life of Hizmet affiliates. Gülen's vision of this process is based on early Sufi scholarship and on the Quran and Hadith. It is theoretical and abstract, rendering its practical application challenging. Nevertheless, affiliates who have never met him but view him as their guide undertake it in ever-increasing numbers. Historically promoted primarily by Sufis, but theoretically equivalent to adab, or proper comportment, elaborated in non-Sufi manuals, it has recently become the focus of Islamic reform initiatives. Their experiences of affect in self-refashioning related it to 5 main themes: self-transformation through language, communal interconnectedness, Gülen's role as a guide and example, Gülen's passing, development through the performance of Hizmet. An environment of trust, love, and companionship surrounds Hizmet people. New quote. When you are surrounded by living examples of compassion and altruism, becoming filled with the desire to devote yourself to serving others is unavoidable.
In my reading, at least, the central point is tafakkur, reflection. So without reflection, knowledge is, well, it's nothing in itself, but if it's fruit for reflection, it might be transformed and used for good purposes, for the soul, for creation, for society. Gülen describes a link between all these different concepts and showing a link between real knowledge through true faith and right conduct. So there's like a causal, you would say in English, cause and effect between those different things. And being a historian of philosophy, of course, I come to think of Socrates, that right conduct and correct knowledge will go together. You can't do wrong if you have the truth. And to me, that's one of the arguments why education is so important. If you have a good education, you will have sound knowledge, which will lead to right conduct. So there is an ethical side of that. And Gülen also states that a good education should lead the students to what he says, wholeness of thought and contemplation. So even if it doesn't talk that much about reflection in a Sufi way, in his writings on education, it's there. So there is, I think, a very nice coherence in his writing and his thinking, where this praxis and action side is present. What we can find, finding this connection from this Emerald Hills of the Heart, is that this is something that he takes from the Islamic tradition very clearly, and I would say it's a parallel. It's not, what do you say, influences from either side. It's rather parallel. He is in tune with society, so he sees the same kind of problems, and the ideas are responses to contemporary problems. And a thinking individual, a reflecting individual, use the knowledge they have at hand, the traditions they have at hand, to find a solution. And the solution will be similar, even though the materials are different. And I think that's also something that is very interesting, and something we have a lot to learn from, that we can mine different traditions and it doesn't lead to different conclusions. It's something that, if it's wisely done, if it's a true reflection, it will be answers that are compatible with contemporary problems.
The conception of sacred space in the Sufi-inspired Hizmet movement associated with Fethullah Gülen is neither locative nor utopian, I'll contend, but combines elements of both. In what can be depicted as an expanding series of 6 circles, similar to the whirling dervishes long associated with Turkish culture, sacred space, as articulated in several key texts by Gülen and as expressed in practices by those in Hizmet, radiates outward from, number 1, the individual in prayer, to 2, the home and family generally. 3, the lighthouses and schools founded by people of service. 4, the space of civil society, art, music, poetry, sports, and acts of benevolence. 5, to the space of dialogical relationship fostered through the movement's emphasis on interreligious engagement. And finally, to the space of nature itself, as evident in Hizmet's emphasis on scientific learning and practice, that together form what we might call a secular sacrality, or what we might call a pragmatic mysticism. In the Hizmet movement, I'll suggest, sacred space is above all moral space. Such a conception of sacred space blends the Sufi and secular histories of Turkey in ways that are negotiated in the details of everyday moral decisions. The Hizmet movement's commitment to interreligious engagement and dialogue toward truth produces a habitus of nonviolence. In other words, dialogue creates a sacred space, neither locative nor utopian, but rather a field in which moral, here invoking my mentor, Martin Marty, and his sense of a clearing, perhaps, a field in which moral practices of nonviolent engagement and persuasion can flourish. One of Gulen's favorite verses from the Quran is the one, I can't cite surah and verse for you, but it reads, and I'm paraphrasing, I have made you different tribes and nations so that you may know each other. Now again, my translation may be off, but somebody who knows Arabic can help me out on that. But he quotes it all the time. And I think the way it gets instantiated or put into practice in the movement, 2 dramatic ways, would be through an event like this one, where we come from very different places, very different traditions, very different commitments, and yet we're learning together to recognize that difference and learn from one another how to live in peace. So the practice of interreligious dialogue and its central importance for him. But then secondly, education. And we'll hear more about this tomorrow in the paper on the schools in Nigeria, but I had the opportunity to visit 2 of the schools in Uganda and several of the schools in Uganda and Kenya. And was stunned to learn that 75% of the students at this school in Kampala are Christian. And here you have young men learning together, across the range of the curriculum from very different tribes and traditions, studying together, living together every day, and learning to live together in peace. And one last anecdote to sort of wrap this up. Last weekend, some of you know, was the American Academy of Religion meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, the professional guild of scholars of religion. And there was a session there on the upcoming election in Nigeria, taking place in 2011, and there's great concern. One of the speakers was the former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, who, let's just say, was not very proud of the kind of things he had to say. Jacob Olapuna, on the other hand, was there from Harvard, spoke about possibility of the indigenous traditions building bridges and the fact that every Muslim is also a practitioner of some indigenous practices. The same is true of Christians. And so we need to think about the multiple identities of people. A young man came up afterwards and spoke and said just some eloquent things, and Nigerian, and I asked him, just out of curiosity, so are you familiar with Hizmet? And he said to me, oh, yeah, the Turks, sure, they're great. Lots of my friends, they tell me, they're with me, they're studying with me at Harvard. He's working on his Ph.D. at Harvard. He says, they tell me if it wasn't for the Turks, I'd be in Al-Shabaab. I'll leave it there by way of knowing the other and the possibilities and the ways the movement builds that into place. I believe the Hizmet movement very clearly is on the side of the peacemakers because within Hizmet, sacred space is moral space. Wherever people are gathered together, doing the good, recognizing the beautiful, speaking the truth, that is a sacred place. And that what I call pragmatic mysticism is some of the deep wisdom of the movement. That's more than one, the elevator speech version, but that's in a nutshell what I'm trying to say. Is sacred space is moral space.
The spirituality within the Gulen movement and the practices of spirituality, which is integral to the Christian faith also. I appreciated the distinction that there is knowledge and spirituality, and those two things necessarily must come together, that the more we have knowledge, the more we are able to work and towards being more spiritual beings. I especially appreciated in this last presentation the talk about sacred space within the Gulen movement and how the sacred space begins with the individual and moves out in successive rings to essentially encompass all of humanity and all of the universe that God has given us. Again, I could almost take this whole cloth into Christianity, but it's good for me to know that Muslims feel much the same way I do. And I really appreciated the emphasis on the role of the individual. As a Christian, in America, I see images of Islam around the world, and it seems to be mass behavior, almost cultism. But learning that prayer is integral, and it is individual prayer that is the center of that sacred space, I find tremendously enlightening, and which is something that I'm going to go back and tweak a little bit, but talk to my congregation about. If you want to create sacred space, you don't need to come to church on Sunday morning, though that's integral to our faith. You need to stop and pray, and the act of prayer will create sacred space.